In British politics, the summer holiday is known as the silly season. This is because politicians are all away on holiday and the media is rather short of something to say, so they resort to reporting inconsequential nonsense. But the start of the silly season, as Parliament disbands, is a time for government to announce bad news, news they hope they can pass unnoticed by the general population. As usual this year, difficult Brexit announcements were made, as was the closure of RAF Scampton, the home of the dambusters in World War II and the home of the Red Arrows today. But if it's the silly season in the UK, then it certainly isn't in the rest of the world. 2018 will, I'm sure, be known as the year of the long, hot summer, and I would like to be able to say at this juncture that it was also the summer when the cause of peace had advanced. Sadly, that just wasn't true. Quite the opposite, in fact. The world has actually become a rather more fractious and volatile place than it has been for some time. And very sadly, the cause of world peace is also not being helped at all by the proliferation of personality-based regimes, with each leader exhibiting varying degrees of megalomania. From his actions and his words, it seems that President Trump appears to have a purely two-dimensional view of the world. In this view, Washington seems to sit like a big spider at the center of its web, and all events elsewhere in the world shuttle backwards and forwards across the web to a greater or lesser extent and to distances out towards the periphery. Bizarrely, this view also seems to chime well with his isolationist redneck supporters, but it certainly ignores the interconnectivity of the global sphere, where events in one part of the world inevitably knock on to places to effects in the other, and then to another, before finally coming back to taunt you. Thus, this politically motivated, rather simple idea of bullying Iran for finding ways of circumventing the nuclear treaty, principally over the development of ballistic missile technology, has strategic effects that seem to have been largely overlooked in the White House. Of course, the withdrawal from the treaty is a truly US-only unilateralist act, which none of the other 5 signatories are bound or indeed likely to follow. US sanctions, which began last Monday, the 6th of August, are to be followed by oil sanctions 90 days later, and they are likely to produce some of the following. First of all, the domestic sanctions now imposed will squeeze the very middle and lower classes that the US had hoped to enlist in undermining the theocratic regime. As consumer goods and medicines dry up, the only true beneficiaries will be Iran's rich elitist black marketeers with close ties to the regime. At the same time, those citizens that stick their heads above the parapet and complain about the nuclear program and the consequent sanctions will be branded as US sympathizers, if not traitors. Second, with China already locked amidst a trade war with the Trump administration, and with China's Asia-focused One Belt, One Road policy, it is almost certain that China will use this opportunity to move closer to Iran. If, as a result of US sanctions, Iranian oil has nowhere to go, then both India and China would be extremely foolish not to take advantage of this spare oil capacity, for the right price, of course. And given China's oil interest in Iran, it's hard to see Beijing voluntarily reducing its investments elsewhere in Iran, especially those in Iran's nuclear energy sector. Now, if China and Iran become closer, then so too must we expect Iran and North Korea. Much of Iran's ballistic missile technology originated in North Korea, and with both of these renegade countries still pursuing nuclear strategies, it is inevitable that Mr. Kim, fresh, we understand, from what must have been a blustery meeting with Mr. Trump, well, that is, if the Putin-Trump meeting is anything to go by, Mr. Kim will seek far closer relations in their aspirations and in their dealings with Washington. It should come as no surprise, therefore, for listeners to learn of the visit yesterday to Tehran by Pyongyang's foreign minister, Ri Yong-ho. These two pariah states will have much to discuss, not least whether to unite in their dealings with the US administration. Turning now to events elsewhere in the Middle East, I think one can now confidently predict that with the help of Russian air power, with help from Hezbollah's militia, with the help from a number of Iraqi militia, and with a sizable deployment of Iraqi forces, the war in Syria is very likely soon to come to a bitter end. President Assad has effectively won this war, and the recriminations will no doubt start soon. But he and his Alawite regime owe a debt of honor to both Hezbollah and Iran, who have not only kept him in power, but more tellingly, have most likely saved his and his family's lives. He and his regime will have to be compliant, if not actually enthusiastic, in whatever Iran seeks next. And the third effect of President Trump's sanctions will be the question of what will happen to the vast number of newly redundant Shiite militiamen in the region, all directly or indirectly under the control of Tehran. As the FT reported, quoting diplomat Mr. Robert Ford, nearly all the Shia militia understand that the American influence in the region sooner or later will diminish, but Iran will always be their neighbor. But if Syria really does become pacified, then the piggy in the middle, Iraq, continues to be a basket case. Following May's general election, no one can be sure who will become the true power broker in Iraq. Frustration over failing water supplies, coupled with frequent electricity outages and little economic progress, has given the largest number of seats to the radical Shiite nationalist cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, followed closely by the seats won by the 120,000-strong militia party, known variously as Hasht al-Shabi, the PMU, or Fatah, run by the pro-Iranian Mr. Hadi al-Amiri. As seems increasingly likely, a coalition between these two large parties would place Iraq increasingly in Iran's camp, from whence Iran would now control 10% of the world's oil production, as well as controlling the Straits of Hormuz, through which over a third of the world's oil passes. To say this leaves Iran in a strong geostrategic position is something of an understatement. Although the rial is falling and the economy under pressure, the population has seen all this before and did not crumble then. Rather, it gave them a focus for their hatred and an opportunity for the clerics to crack down on any liberals. So, given Iran's perceived persecution by the US and Hezbollah's antipathy to Israel, the newly unemployed militia will surely turn their hands to something else. As the saying goes, the devil makes work for idle hands. And Israel is particularly vulnerable. Israel's move of its capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, coupled with the US's move of her embassy, as well as the continuing bloodshed in Gaza, have all conspired to create a casus belli when things go wrong, as they surely will. Although Mr. Trump is on the verge of revealing his ultimate deal for Palestine, both Fatah administration in Ramallah, as well as the Hamas organization in Gaza, have already signaled that what is proposed is weighed far too much in favor of Israel. And even with considerable Saudi support, it's difficult to see this ultimate deal as anything more than just one more sterile proposal. Now, although I don't want to appear alarmist, it does seem that the stage is now set for one of the more worrying confrontations than we have seen in recent history. To the north of the Persian Gulf sit the Shiite states, more or less tied by some sort of fealty to Iran, from Alawite Syria to volatile Iraq to angry Iran, all supported to a greater or lesser degree by Russia and China. To the south sit the allies of the USA, Israel, the Sunni Gulf Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. To the north, there will soon be unemployed irregular militias boiling for a fight, and to the south are the sophisticated nations, rich in infrastructure and armed with high technology. While both Iran and Saudi remain as non-nuclear powers, any confrontation across the Gulf could hopefully be controllable. But should either, or indeed presumably both, acquire nuclear weapons, then the consequences could be truly unthinkable. And finally, into this bubbling Middle Eastern cauldron we have Turkey. Hitherto a staunch NATO ally, one that fought with distinction in the Korean War, Turkey is increasingly in the hands of a sultan-like figure whose rule is increasingly autocratic and capricious. Over 50,000 Turkish citizens were arrested and, according to Amnesty, a further 107,000 summarily dismissed from their posts, all for their supposed involvement in the 2016 coup. Judges are now appointed by decree, and freedom of expression and freedom of assembly seriously curtailed. The media is largely state-controlled. In 2003, the Erdogan government refused to allow its principal ally to deploy troops from Turkish borders, and following years of worsening relations involving, amongst other things, Iranian sanction busting by Turkey's Halk Bank and attacks on the Kurds whose Peshmerga fought ISIS as America's allies, the Erdogan regime criticized the US for not condemning the 2016 attempted coup quickly enough and for supposedly harboring its initiator, Fethullah Gulen. In what increasingly appears a tit-for-tat action, Turkey arrested Pastor Andrew Brunson, a US citizen whom they accused of being one of the plotters, and he remains under arrest despite a trilateral agreement that Israel would release a Turkish national, Ms. Ozkan, who had been apprehended smuggling currency to Hamas. After a fractious Trump-Erdogan phone call, the US has now imposed sanctions on the politicians responsible for Mr. Brunson's detainment, the Ministers of Justice and the Interior. The President of Turkey has now gone further and accused the US President of psychological warfare. Meanwhile, in Ankara, the Turkish lira is falling and the bank's under pressure, but no doubt Mr. Erdogan will portray this as yet another hostile act by the West. Meanwhile, of course, Turkish relations with Russia have been improving. At a time of growing antipathy between the United States and Turkey, Turkey and Russia agreed to cooperate on Syria, to construct a new gas pipeline to Turkey, and to supply Turkey with the advanced Russian S-400 missile defense system. Understandably, the US has now postponed deliveries of its most advanced F-35 fighter for fear that the technology could fall into the hands of Russia. Such actions by Turkey, coupled with Mr. Erdogan's stated intention of joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a full member, a body which both Russia and China aspire to make into the Asian version of a combined EU and NATO, place considerable doubt on Turkey's continuing reliability as an ally. So, where do we go from here? Well, with the anti-ISIS glue, which for the past 5 years has kept all these very disparate groups, if not together, then at least in some form of cooperation. With that glue now fast coming unstuck, what does the future hold for the Middle East in particular and the world in general? Well, if history teaches us anything, it is to beware the power of a populist nationalist leader with an overinflated ego. Every time one has been thrown up, and one can think of people like Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, Napoleon, to name but a few, then bloodshed has ensued, and the resulting chaos took decades, if not centuries, to sort out. Between the two world wars, there were 2 or arguably 3 such idolized personalities. Now, in 2018, we have at least 4 in major positions of power, together with a whole host of petty autocratic acolytes. Can they all live in harmony in this world of 8 billion people? I wonder. Where have all the true statesmen gone when you need them? Are they all on holiday?